So, is this mic working? Okay. So, my name is Sunil Sabnis. I just graduated from Cornell last week, and I'll be starting my master's program this upcoming fall right here at Cornell Tech. So, staying in the Cornell family. And I worked on this paper with Renzhe and Professor Kizilcec this past year in the Future of Learning Lab. And yeah, so it's titled Large Scale Student Data Reveal Sociodemographic Gaps in Procrastination Behavior. So, a quick overview of the paper before I get into kind of the details of it. It's a large-scale behavioral analytics study where we examine procrastination across multiple sociodemographic groups, and we do this to really understand how procrastination might relate to educational inequalities, such as achievement gaps. So, as procrastination is the focus of the study, it's important to kind of just talk about procrastination for a bit. So, it's defined as the task delay, the intentional task delay that students do, including myself, even though we have the understanding that it's harmful and definitely not a good thing. Even for when I was preparing for this presentation, there was ample amounts of procrastination. Um, so the literature is also quite rich, and psychology research has shown that procrastination is caused by intrinsic and external factors. So intrinsic factors include anything from motivation, self-conscientiousness, self-regulation. External factors can include anything from a student study environment, how a course is designed, and how a task is structured. So now, in terms of consequences of procrastination, the research has largely shown that procrastination is harmful, mostly harmful, sometimes harmless, but never really helpful to students, academic performance and overall mental well-being. Now, the literature is rich and it's been a well-studied area for decades, but there's still something important missing. So, from an equity perspective that we were interested in, we were wondering how this prevalent procrastination phenomenon that many students deal with, how this might relate to educational inequalities and um, how this relates, such as like achievement gaps. So this leads us to our key question or primary purpose of the study that I was hinting about in the last part of that slide. How does procrastination relate to educational inequality? And a large share of learning analytics research, the focus isn't really on that like this equity driven perspective when you're relating like a behavior like procrastination to performance. It's usually just that single relationship and not this extra dimension of sociodemographic characteristics. So in our study, we have access to sociodemographic data provided by the registrar of the university, and we use this to kind of answer this question. So the research questions we developed to answer this broader question are first, how does procrastination behavior vary across sociodemographic student groups? Second, to what extent can procrastination behavior explain achievement gaps? And finally, how does the association between procrastination and achievement vary across sociodemographic student groups and of courses of different sizes? Now, before I get into how we answer these research questions, I think it's important to kind of go over the research context and the data we're using in this study. So first, we analyze procrastination in the context of online assignment submission data. This is collected by a campus-wide learning management system, specifically Canvas, and it's at a large U.S. research institution. It's also over a 5-year period, and part of this period was during the COVID-19 pandemic when instruction was completely virtual for many courses. So the final data set we construct after extensive data cleaning includes over 2.5 million assignment submissions made by over 25,000 students across over 2,000 courses. And as I hinted at, like the courses vary in anything from academic level to how the instruction mode was virtual, hybrid versus in person, and other course level features. This table on the right nicely shows the demographic composition of this final data set. And as shown in the table, there are significant first generation college students and underrepresented minority students. So now back to answering the first research, or before I answer the first research question, I'll go over this procrastination measure or index that we developed to kind of answer the research questions. So we define procrastination as we operationalize on submission timestamps, and basically we create two indexes. So the most basic unit is the assignment level procrastination score. And to do this, we take all the student submissions to a particular assignment and we rank it in terms of percentiles based on their relative submission times to each other. So I think it's easier if I go through an example. Let's take an example course that has some number of assignments, and let's just focus on assignment 0. So for assignment 0, there are some number of student submissions to this particular assignment. So we rank them, and for example, in this case, student 1 is assigned an assignment level procrastination score of 0.2. And this indicates that their submission was in the top 20th percentile of submissions relative to the other submissions to assignment 0. This is precisely the assignment level procrastination score, and it's formally defined by this expression right here. Now, as our analysis is situated at the student course level, we have to have some way to kind of aggregate these little assignment level procrastination scores. So the way we do this, we just take the average of all the assignment level procrastination scores of a student, and that is precisely that student's procrastination score within a course. So for student 1, for example, we would take all these little blue dots, which are their assignment level procrastination scores, and take the average of that, and that is their student level procrastination score and the main measure we use for procrastination. Now, in a similar fashion, we normalize the course scores or grades for students by ranking each student's final course score relative to their classmates in the class. So the grade field or performance metric that we use is normalized and kind of mirrors this exact same procrastination score, as all the values are between 0 and 1. Okay, so now that we have this procrastination measure defined, we can now go back to our research questions and kind of answer them. So our first research question was, how does procrastination behavior vary across sociodemographic student groups? And to answer this question, we first create a graph. And in this graph, the x-axis is the mean procrastination score for each subgroup, and the y-axis is the different sociodemographic group. And as shown by this graph, there are significant differences in procrastination behavior across different groups. And I guess the most important takeaway is that first generation college students, male students, and underrepresented minority students tend to procrastinate more relative to their counterparts. Now, this was kind of an exploratory graph, but we also verify these kind of differences or gaps with a regression model, and it echoes the same information. In this regression model, we're predicting procrastination using these sociodemographic characteristics, and it kind of echoes the same message as the previous graph, where underrepresented minority students, first generation minority students, and male students tend to procrastinate more compared to their peers. So now to answer the second question, to what extent can procrastination behavior explain achievement gaps? And to do this, we train 3 different regression models. This first regression model, in each of these regression models, we're predicting course performance. And so in the first model, we use only the procrastination score as a feature. And the first model kind of shows that there's the strong negative relationship between procrastination and performance. And this is as expected, considering the prior research and literature on the relationship between procrastination and academic performance. Now, in the second model, we again predict performance, but we only use sociodemographic characteristics as features. Um, this model results kind of just show the existing disparities in higher education in terms of achievement gaps. And in the third model, we reintroduce procrastination score index back into as a feature, along with the sociodemographic characteristics. And what we see by adding procrastination back in is that it kind of attenuates the magnitude of differences between the coefficient estimates, and that kind of suggests that procrastination partially explains these achievement gaps. But to further look into this like partial explanatory power of procrastination on achievement gaps, we also fit a structural equation model that kind of resembles a mediation model. So what we know right now is that sociodemographic characteristics has a relationship with performance, and that procrastination also has a relationship with performance. But what we want to know is how much of this sociodemographic characteristics to performance path is mediated through procrastination. So that's exactly what this structural equation model answers. And the model tells us that there's a 20% indirect effect estimate. And this signifies that 20% of, um, of achievement gaps are explained by procrastination. Now, to answer our third research question, how does the association between procrastination and achievement vary across sociodemographic student groups and courses of different sizes? We also create another plot. And in this plot, the x-axis is again procrastination score or procrastination, and the y-axis is course performance. And I guess what we see is that there's a significant negative relationship between procrastination and performance. And again, this isn't very surprising given the existing research. But what is surprising is that the slope is pretty constant at different levels of procrastination, and it's a very linear relationship with performance. What also is surprising, and is another finding, is that even after we control for procrastination, and by that I mean look at procrastination at different levels, there's still significant achievement gaps between these groups. I guess I forgot to mention, but the 4 lines on the screen here are 4 intersectional student groups defined by whether a student is an underrepresented minority or a first generation student. So, for example, the dark green line is a student that is a first generation student and an underrepresented minority. So yeah, even after we control for procrastination, there still are significant achievement gaps between these groups. Now, to answer the second part of our third research question, we create another plot where the x-axis is the correlation, the Pearson's correlation coefficient between performance and procrastination, and the y-axis is the course enrollment size. So each dot on this graph represents one course. Um, And basically, what this plot shows is that there's significant variation in the strength of this procrastination performance relationship across all the courses in our data set. Um, this raises the question of what course level features might be responsible for this variation and why this relationship has so much variation. So, a quick recap and summary of our findings. First, low socioeconomic students exhibit more procrastination behavior than their counterparts. Second, procrastination behavior explains 20% of variation in achievement gaps. And finally, we see a constant negative relationship across sociodemographic groups and at different levels of procrastination. So now we can get into the discussion and implication of these findings. First, as this is one of the largest scale behavioral analysis of procrastination, our study really widely reaffirms this strong negative relationship between procrastination and performance that other studies have shown, but at a smaller scale. And then the negative association that's consistent across sociodemographic groups and performance levels kind of indicates that for any student, an intervention to kind of stop procrastination or is beneficial for all students. Second, our findings kind of suggest that there's unequal educational experiences. So from one perspective, you can view procrastination as a systemic issue because of the wide variation across sociodemographic groups in terms of procrastination behavior. But from another lens, you can see procrastination as a behavioral antecedent of educational inequality, as the as it has a largely linear relationship with performance. And this suggests that it's a malleable factor that instructors can affect and help students with. And in doing so, potentially reduce achievement gaps. And finally, for practical implications, so the measure we define the procrastination score is a very simple measure that can be used in different institutional and course contexts, and it only relies on one field, the submission timestamp. It takes minimal assumptions about the courses, and yeah, so instructors can use this measure to identify students that are procrastinating and possibly intervene and provide them the appropriate help. Thank you.
Thanks. This is really super interesting. My mind was wandering a little bit. I think I've been engaging in a lot of procrastination in my own work, but this may be naive. But you said that the data set is huge and it spans pre-COVID and post. Have you looked at all the pre-COVID data and looked at the post-COVID data and are there differences between
That,
them?
yeah, that's a really interesting question. I would like to do that, but in this study we didn't really do that yet. But that's definitely a future research direction that I'm curious about because I know during COVID, for me at least, I definitely procrastinated more, and it makes sense because students also might have been given more extensions, which can distort kind of findings during COVID. And there were a lot of different factors that probably impacted procrastination levels during that time.
Hi, it really interesting study, and just a few questions about the work. In your paper, do you talk about what kind of interventions would be effective, or propose those for effectiveness? And then another question I have is about your demographics. You talk a lot about these um, demographics of these socio demographics, but do you have any way to have access into, say, maybe some learning challenges or people who are neuroatypical, about how those would be correlated to procrastination?
Wait, sorry, can you repeat like the second part of that question?
Oh, anybody who has like learning challenges,
Okay.
or are neuroatypical, and they may have different routes to procrastination. Do you have any way to access that information for maybe
From
deeper,
the
another dimension of this study?
Okay. Yeah, we only have sociodemographic variables for like first generation, race slash ethnicity, and underrepresented minority status and gender. So I think that kind of investigating more into specific learning um, aspects of students is a very interesting part, but that wasn't part of like the data we had. But yeah, that's definitely a future research direction. And then for the first part of that question, sorry, what was that again? Oh, the interventions, right. So this could be anything from like the teacher uses the procrastination index within a course to kind of evaluate different procrastination levels after each assignment in the course, and kind of evaluates how this is relating to their performance. And as the course goes on, like if you keep identifying a student that's exhibiting procrastination through this metric, you can possibly have an intervention, talk to the student, and maybe ask them like maybe like why are you like procrastinating? I guess not why are you procrastinating, but because but yeah, no, I am a heavy
We know we're
procrastinator.
procrastinating.
Yeah,
We know it.
yeah, but yeah, I don't really have an answer for like what specific intervention or how you would go about that. But that's a future potential application of the measure.
So I've spent the last couple of years at University of Central Florida trying to develop um, this sort of a metric in terms of how do you define procrastination. I guess is it is it possible under this metric for no one to procrastinate, or is that not conceivable?
So we define it in a very like relative, comparable kind of lateness way in terms of like there's always going to be some proportion of students procrastinating
Okay.
because it's a relative metric and it's at the assignment level. So each assignment will have certain students in the more like point 0.7 to 1.0 procrastination score, and that's how we kind of define procrastination in this study. It's obviously in other studies, it might be more of like a binary kind of indicator, but we kind of went for the approach where it's on a more continuous scale and we can see different levels of procrastination.
So there's no way to differentiate either between um, the procrastination that's associated with lack of engagement with material and people whose schedules cause them to plan in advance to work late. You can't differentiate that either then.
Not real.
Okay.
That's a limitation of this metric, but in order to have like a scalable kind of analysis, that's kind of part of it. And as many studies kind of show in their limitations, any kind of behavioral metric defined by clickstream data is imperfect. You don't have
Yeah.
the full picture. You don't have all the context. So it's definitely a limitation, but that's kind of what we gave up for scalability.
course. Thanks.
Is okay? Yeah, I just wanted to ask about the choice of the term procrastination for the study,
Mhm.
and I want to ask that because we chuckle like we can't just reach out to them and say, why can you just stop procrastinating? And I guess what my curiosity is I really appreciated the nuance you had in the different lenses for interpretation, that there's a component of individual responsibility at play here, and there's a component of structural analysis of what can be done to sort of like address or alleviate any barriers that might be contributing to that outcome. And if I understand the metric correctly, the way that I thought about interpreting it was much more about um, late submission.
Mhm.
And late submission isn't necessarily, from my perspective, a value judgment. There's lots of reasons why outside responsibilities might result in late submission for a course assignment. But if we say procrastination, it just feels like an immediate criticism
Right.
on the student. And I was just curious about, did you struggle with that terminology, or is that something that you just feel like is the right language to be using here?
Yeah, it was definitely hard to kind of come up with a term for this measure. We felt procrastination was appropriate, and I guess going back to this graph, so we sacrifice maybe, um, sorry, lost my train of thought. But so this graph shows like a large linear relationship between performance and procrastination. So when you're looking at it at scale, um, you can see that the like even though we might be missing some contextual information, like someone just submits assignments late normally, or they have an extension. But overall, when we're looking at across over 2,000 courses, we see that it has a large negative relationship with performance. So in that way, it we kind of interpreted procrastination as like a bad thing, which I would say, yeah, sorry.
I don't think I'm disagreeing with the notion of late submissions as being a bad thing for students' outcomes and performance, but I think what I'm questioning is like, is this data potentially showing us that there are groups of students for which maybe there's lots of outside demands in their life outside of the course
Oh,
that make it difficult for them to be submitting things on the time schedule of the course design? And to me, if that was part of what is an underlying current within this data, then I would feel a little bit uncomfortable talking to students in terms of procrastination.
right.
Like,
Yeah.
oh, you've got like 5 jobs on top of like the full course load, and like that's terrible and difficult to manage that schedule. And yes, in that structure, you will have late assignments.
Yeah.
And I just wouldn't describe that person as procrastinating, I guess is what I'm trying to tease out.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And having that kind of contextual data of like how many courses even a student is enrolled in for a semester would be really helpful. But in our data set, we only had these sociodemographic characteristics that was joined with the like assignment submission data. But yeah, that would be really helpful to know, and it would provide a more rich like lens to conduct this analysis through.
Really interesting work. I can imagine you have a lot of data. I wonder if you have enough data points per instructor so that you could estimate the tendency of students in general under a certain instructor to procrastinate less or more, like include a random factor into the regression. Not, I'm driving this not to just which professors, influence procrastination or not, but maybe which professors know a trick, are stricter in the beginning, let's say, or lenient in the middle of the course, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I know I've had my fair share of professors where I know I'm going to procrastinate more in this class just because it's harder. Um, we didn't conduct that type of analysis, but that I think that's a really interesting kind of analysis to look into. And that ties back into like what course level features are responsible for this large variation we see in the association or the strength of the association between procrastination and performance. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the point that, first of all, thank you for this work. Thank you for the point that procrastination isn't the reason that students have late submissions. I want you to strike the word procrastination from everything you've said and just say late submissions. That's all you're doing. You're talking about late submissions. It makes no sense to have intent behind the late submissions. There are many factors for that. There's a movement, Dan Garcia, UC Berkeley, there's a movement grading for equity that is sweeping the country and sweeping the world, which really this is a very large advocate for, which says, why do we have hard deadlines? Students need some flexible deadlines for the submissions because of the reasons you just say. There may be reasons of taking 5 jobs, there may be reasons of other issues. So this is the strongest case that I've seen that says all of the instructors, if you really care about equity, you cannot just have a frozen deadline and say if it's due on Saturday, you get full credit. If it's due on Sunday, if it's you submit on Sunday, it's half credit, and Monday you get no credit. That makes no sense for students who need a little flexibility with their work. So I want to share that idea with all of us who are educators to think about why are we freezing our deadlines and why aren't we giving a little bit of flexibility for students who need it? And this data says many students need it. The students, underserved students need it most. So thank you for this work, but I really do want you to strike the word procrastination away from this. It's the wrong word. The right word is late assignments. That's all you're saying. You're measuring late assignments. Intent is procrastination. We don't know what their intent is. You just said it. So you need to strike that from this work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, it's really cool work. Hi, I have a question. So when you say procrastination, the first thing I think of is like, you don't actually do the work until the deadline, right? Like you compress it in a couple of hours. But a lot of times Canvas submission time is like when you actually turn in the file. It doesn't actually capture when the students actually work on the file. So you can have a situation where like students will work, maybe 4 weeks in advance and they work consistently every week, but then they submit at like either the last second or, maybe they submit late. So I think from like a methodology point of view, calling it late submission would make a lot more sense. And we know that some teachers actually decrease scores. So of course, if you submit an assignment late, it's going to have a negative outcome on your grades. So that's the other thing. So like following up, it's like a really, really cool study. And like, I think the, equity like implication is really cool. And it'll be kind of interesting to be able to maybe in a future study to split out instructors, allow flexible deadline, and then measure purely based on student learning outcome versus like a grades that may be correlated with assignment turning in, something like that.
I guess from one perspective, though, you could also argue that students that work ahead of time but still submit really close to the deadline or super late relative to their peers, they can be viewed as perfectionists in some sense. And I know I've been like that in some courses. And you can also interpret that as procrastinating because you're still detracting time from maybe other work you need to do. And that can be detrimental as well. Even if you started early, you work consistently on it, but you're still spending more time on it compared to your peers, which can be detrimental.
Okay, one quick question, and then we're gonna break for.
I just wanted to jump in. Sunil has done an amazing job. I want to clarify one thing. So I take everybody's point about how procrastination sounds bad. There's a big literature on procrastination that defines it as a purely behavioral thing with no judgment attached, right? And that is really what was driving this choice. Procrastination literature in psychology does not say it is a negative thing by itself, and there's no intentionality necessarily attached with it. It's really just the act of postponing something. So that's what's driving it. We all perceive it as something bad and as a negative thing, but it's really about the systemic factors that lead to these behaviors, as Sunil was saying. And this plot to me is what needs to be unpacked the most. Like, what is it that some instructors are doing in these courses that makes it so that students who can't make it on time still don't do worse, right? And we don't see these inequities pop up as a result.
Is there time? It's just
Very
really a
quick.
quick comment. At the National Science Foundation, we have over a number of years experimented with no deadlines for some of our solicitations. The jury is still out. It causes actually a lot more work for us. We hear anecdotally that principal investigators like no deadlines. On the other hand, we have some anecdotal evidence that submissions from principal investigators who are from groups that are underrepresented in their submissions is going down, perhaps correlated to no deadline. So this is a murky area for us, very different but related here. So this is a fascinating paper. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was